So, good evening, everyone, officially. I am grateful for this opportunity to share this time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, graduating from Mount Pleasant Public High School before I went on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from Mount Holyoke College. My 27-year career with the DuPont Company in Wilmington culminated with the spinoff of its medical X-ray business via a leveraged buyout that created Sterling Diagnostic Imaging, of which I was its first president. I'm especially proud of the long-term R&D investment by my business that developed a selenium array for image capture that today is at the heart of virtually every mammography machine in use in the United States. I'm a co-founder of the Westminster Peace and Justice Work Group in Wilmington that was formed in the spring of 2018 with the twin goals of combating violence in Wilmington and promoting racial justice. The work group is affiliated with a number of community organizations, the Delaware Center for Justice, Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice, Peace Week Delaware, Smart Justice Delaware, among many others. I grew up in a virtually all-white environment. Until I graduated from high school, the only Black person I knew was our mailman, Mr. Brown. Then two significant events occurred. My summer job that year, taking the first Delaware state census, had me going door to door throughout the city of Wilmington, conversing with hundreds of people who didn't look like me. That fall, I found myself on a multiracial campus at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, 1963 to 1967. These experiences launched a journey that continues to this day. I've had a lifelong interest in history, and I was a political science history major in college. Yet I didn't discover until 5 or 6 years ago that I was missing a significant portion of our country's history. In my experience, American history classes covered Columbus, the Pilgrims, the Revolutionary War, the colonies, the Civil War, and a bit of Reconstruction with those darn carpetbaggers. And then it picked up again somewhere around World War II. It was a series of police shootings of unarmed Black men in recent years that galvanized me to develop a better understanding of how we got to where we are. And what I learned is that much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear, or even hold ourselves, are a direct consequence of intentional public and economic policy and biased beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. Other countries with similarly sordid racial pasts have sought to move forward via a process called truth and reconciliation. I believe America is in desperate need of such a process. So we here for these 6 weeks will embark on a search for more truth. Much of it is painful, especially for those of us who profess to believe that every person is a child of God, who believe that we are good people who seek peace and justice for all. I believe that in bringing to light this history of ours that we should have known but didn't, we may be transformed in deeply meaningful ways with a new or renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address the profound inequities that persist in our society today. So let's get started. We'll begin with a couple of definitions. The first is prejudice, which is an unfavorable opinion formed without personal knowledge, thought, or reason. And one of the reasons that racial prejudice is so significant is the legacy of segregation, where we live separate from one another. And we did not have the opportunity to get to know one another on a personal level. And when there isn't that personal knowledge, something has to rush in and fill the vacuum. And it is stereotypes often based on significant aspects of prejudice. White supremacy, I'm not talking about white supremacists, the tiki torch carrying, violent, horrific people that we've seen in Charlottesville and elsewhere, but rather white supremacy is a belief that white people are inherently superior to people from all other racial groups, especially Black people. And therefore, white people are rightfully the dominant group in any society. And we see this everywhere in terms of candidates, in terms of elections, in terms of all sorts of decision-making around leadership. So often that view, that sense that white people are superior is not something we would articulate, but it exists often somewhere, and it affects our beliefs and our behaviors. Racism is discrimination that is directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group. Typically one that's minority, but if we think about South Africa, the racism directed against Black people were by far the majority in that society, and yet they were the targets of racism, which is a system of prejudice backed by power. So racism is not simply thoughts or words, statements or actions. It's a system, and it is one that is embedded and supported by a system of power. So people say, well, can't Black people be racist? And I believe the answer to that is they can be, they can hate white people, they can resent white people, they can have all sorts of negative beliefs, experiences, and feelings, but there is no system of power that gives Black people authority or a system that controls white people. So that is unique to those of us who are white. Now, as we go through this class series, I'm going to use a variety of terminology: African, slave, Negro, African American, Black, Black people, people of color, seeking to be faithful to the time period and the context in which the term is used. Some of these classes include quotations from individuals who use one of the most derogatory terms, and I will quote them. I have done classes before where I have substituted the phrase, the N-word, but I think hearing the quote in its actual format is really powerful. So we have 6 classes. The first tonight is the early years, from 1619 in the British colonies through the Civil War and Reconstruction. Next week, we move chronologically to the period following that I have labeled Slavery by Another Name. As Bryan Stevenson, activist, author, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, native of Georgetown, Delaware, has famously said, slavery didn't end with the Civil War, it evolved. And we will explore that evolution next week. Then we turn our attention to the 20th century and public policy and the civil rights movement, both of which have been instrumental in leading us to where we are today. Our fourth class focuses on the criminal justice system, where we look at mass incarceration and the war on drugs. Then class number 5 is the one that changes the most every time I give this class, because it focuses on voter suppression then and now. And the now changes every week. So we will look at that aspect of citizenship rights in the United States, specifically as they apply to Black people. And then I think probably the most important class is the sixth one, which is where do we go from here? As Maya Angelou has famously said, when you know better, do better. And so once we learn these aspects of our history previously unknown to us, and we see the inequities that exist, the question is, what are we individually and collectively called to do about this? So let's begin. We are standing on an area of land in the British colony of Virginia. It's called Point Comfort. And we're looking east toward Africa. We may know there Africa is over there, we may not, but we look east and appears on the horizon a ship, and it is in considerable distress. It is a British privateer ship called the White Lion, and it has had a very difficult crossing from Africa. And it is in desperate need of resupply and repairs. And the colonists, as is their wont, are happy to help. They work on the repairs, they provide the supplies that the captain and crew request. And in return, they are compensated by the delivery of 20 plus captured Angolans. These captives were actually removed from a Portuguese slave ship that the White Lion encountered during its voyage. And so the captain pays the colonists for their assistance by giving them these 20 kidnapped Angolans. And this marks the first point at which Africans set foot in the British colonies in the New World. Now they come to a period of time where the colonial workforce is largely indentured servants who have come from Europe. Tobacco cultivation is the primary agricultural concern at this point. But the issue is tobacco is very hard on the soil. It leaches out the nutrients that can't be readily replenished back in the day. And so you can't plant crop after crop of tobacco in the same land, which is one of the things that drove the westward expansion, as the colonists took all the land that they wanted from the Native Americans so that they could expand the area where they grew tobacco. At the same time, the colonists recognized that the Native Americans were not ideal workers in these agricultural fields. And so they began recruiting Europeans, poor Europeans, to come to the New World under contract. It was typically 7 years, where the worker would come to the colonies, work for 7 years for no pay, and at the end of that time be granted their freedom, as it were, given some land and the opportunity to establish themselves as regular participants in the society. So that was the system in place when the Africans began arriving. And they, beyond that landing of the White Lion and the first 20 plus Angolans, the colonies began to see the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, which was led by Portugal, Britain, Spain, France, Holland, and Denmark. Those were the 6 major countries involved in the transatlantic slave trade, bringing kidnapped Africans to the New World. This came about by virtue of delivering these Africans as cargo on slave ships. During the period of time of the transatlantic slave trade, more than 20 million Africans were taken from their homes and transported, marched to the coast. During that transit, almost half of them died because of the conditions. So 20 million were kidnapped and about 10.7 million made it to the coast where they could be loaded onto slave ships. As they were transported to the New World, nearly 2 million of those 10.7 million people died. The slaves were branded with hot irons and they were restrained with shackles. Their living quarters was often a deck within the ship that had less than 5 feet of headroom. And throughout a large portion of the deck, as you can see by the schematic sleeping shelves, cut this limited amount of headroom in half. Lack of standing headroom was the least of their problems, however, with 300 to 400 people packed in a tiny area, an area with no ventilation, and in some cases, not even enough space to place buckets for human waste. Disease was prevalent, hence 2 million died. So that the largest possible cargo could be carried, the captives were wedged below decks, chained to low-lying platforms, stacked in tiers, with an average individual space allotment that was 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, and maybe 3 feet high. Unable to stand erect or turn over, many slaves died in this position. And many of the ship's logs contain reports of what are referred to as shivers of sharks, who used to follow these ships because they knew that food would be plentiful when the dead slaves' corpses were tossed overboard. This was called the Middle Passage because the first leg of the journey went from Europe to Africa. The Middle Passage brought the slaves from Africa to the New World, and the third passage was a return with goods from the New World that went back to Europe. And this Middle Passage, depending on weather and circumstance, might take anywhere from 21 to 90 days. And so that was the duration that these captured Africans endured. When they first began to arrive, they were sort of adopted into the indentured servitude system. It was working, and it seemed reasonable. So contracts were made. Slaves worked the 7 years, got their freedom, which is why we will read stories of Black people in the British colonies who were landowners and who owned slaves. Because when they first arrived, they were allowed to participate in the indentured servitude system. But as thousands and thousands of these Africans began arriving, differentiation began to take place. The Europeans were covered by English common law, but the Africans were not. Further, the church declared that all Christians must be considered free men, but the Africans weren't Christians, so they were not considered by the church to have the same rights. And even after missionaries began converting slaves to Christianity, the church said, yeah, but you're a different kind of Christian, and our view of you is not the same of the ones who came from Europe. And so as time went on, the institution of slavery became legalized between 1641 and 1750. In 1641, slavery was first legalized in the colony of Massachusetts. And the last colony to legalize slavery was actually Georgia. And what did that mean to legalize slavery? The colonies wrote laws that declared that these Africans were chattel. They were not people. They were property, and they were owned for life. Further, the condition of slavery was hereditary, and it passed to the offspring through the status of the mother. This ran counter to every rule of legacy and inheritance in place at the time, where everything went through the male. But in the case of slavery, it was the condition of the mother, whose every child would be a slave, regardless of whether the father was a slave or not. In the North, the slaves were typically house servants or unpaid skilled labor. Many of these Africans were artisans, had ability to do crafts and all kinds of skills. And so they were put to work in the northern colonies and states, but again, not paid, still slaves. And even in the North, they were relegated to a subhuman status. They were not people. Slaves were not taught to read or write. In many colonies and states, it was against the law to teach a slave to read or write, and the owner or the person doing the teaching could be incarcerated. They were not allowed to marry. There was no sanctioned relationship between men and women. And a new identity began to develop based on the social construct of race. And the myth of racial inferiority developed and persisted as a justification for treating these subhumans as property. And it was in 1671 that the first print reference to white people ever appeared. There had been no need to define people as white if there wasn't anybody in the colonies who wasn't. But by this time, with the influx of slaves, the delineation, the distinction between white and black took place. And initially, white people only referred to Anglo-Saxons, and that continued for decades. In fact, there's a lot in our history that says when the Irish, the Italians, the Poles came to the New World, they were not considered white. They had to find a way to assimilate into the white culture, and they could, and they did, but the Africans could not. And in 1676, there occurred a really pivotal event that I kind of glossed over when I began doing this research, Bacon's Rebellion. What's that? I saw it mentioned, but I didn't pay a lot of attention. But in more recent times, I've started delving into that a little bit, and I have found that that event has had a significant impact to this day on the issues of white and black in the United States. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy white planter, and he was a relative of Virginia's governor, William Berkeley. But they didn't like each other, they didn't get along. And Nathaniel Bacon wanted the colony under Berkeley to retaliate for raids by Native Americans on the frontier settlements and remove all the Native Americans from the colony so that landowners like himself could expand their holdings. But Governor Berkeley was concerned that if that action was taken, it might unite all of the Native American tribes in the area and would cause significant danger to the colony of Virginia, so he refused. As a consequence, Nathaniel Bacon organized his own militia, and it consisted of black and white indentured servants and enslaved black people who joined on the promise of their freedom. And the militias between Bacon and Berkeley began skirmishing with one another. And finally, in September of 1676, Bacon's militia captured Jamestown and burned it to the ground. Now, Nathaniel Bacon died of a fever about a month later, and the rebellion collapsed. But Virginia's wealthy planters were deeply shaken by the idea of a rebel militia that united white and black servants and slaves to destroy the colonial capital. And so they began passing laws that restricted and constrained the capabilities of the Black slaves and granted the poor white people additional rights and benefits that were theirs to drive a wedge between the enslaved Africans and the poor white people and even the Black indentured people. And we see that even today, where often white poorer people will vote against their own best interest because it might somehow benefit a Black person. And that wedge, that separation between poor white and Black was forged as a consequence of Bacon's Rebellion and continues to the present. So all of this continued, but in the late 1700s, the northern states began to be uncomfortable with the institution of slavery. It was less efficient for them. It was not an agricultural economy. Slaves per se were not essential to the economy of the North, and it became less socially accepted. The abolitionist movement began in the North. And so over that period of 30 years, all of the northern colonies and states abolished slavery. Now, in the midst of this time period came the drafting and the ratification of the United States Constitution and the creation of our country. As you can imagine, as the anti-slavery movement was proceeding in the North and the value of slaves was accelerating in the South, there was a tremendous amount of conflict between the two sets of colonies to become states. And at the heart of it was representation in Congress, because that would be a function of the population of the states. And so the South, the southern states, said, we want all our slaves counted as people. They're not, and they can't vote, and they don't have any rights, but we want them counted for the purposes of our representation. And the northern colonies to become states said, well, that's not right. And so a compromise was worked out, and it is written into the United States Constitution as ratified that a slave would count as 3/5 of a person, not a whole person. Interestingly, Native Americans counted as nothing. In fact, the only reference to Native Americans in our founding documents is them being referred to as merciless Indian savages. That's it. So in addition, written into the Constitution, the southern states were concerned that their slaves might try to escape and go to the North and think that they would be free. And so there is a fugitive slave clause that is written into the Constitution as ratified that requires that any slave escaping from a slave state to a free state must be returned to his or her owner. But apparently that wasn't sufficient to stop a lot of slaves from escaping. So in 1793, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law, and it said that the government had the responsibility of apprehending these escaped slaves and returning them to their owners. And it also provided for slave owners in southern states to create slave patrols that would search for escapees within the borders of the free states and return them to their owners. You may have seen the film 10 Years a Slave, where a Black man in the North walking on the street, and one of these slave patrols took him and sent him to the South as a slave, even though he had never been a slave. But of course, they were compensated based on the number of people that they returned to the southern states. So there we have it. The US Constitution was ratified with those provisions included. Interestingly, in 1807, Great Britain elected to cease its participation in the transatlantic slave trade, and it was followed by the other European countries. And in 1808, the US outlawed the importation of slaves. And you look at that and you say, well, was that because Britain stopped? And so the US said, well, if you're not going to do it, we're not going to do it. No. Written into the Constitution was a condition that the United States could outlaw the importing of African slaves, but only after at least 20 years had passed. And so the Constitution ensured that the transatlantic slave trade would continue for at least 20 years, bringing more Africans to the US. As soon as Congress had the wherewithal to pass that ban, they did. But there was still a demand for more and more slaves. The economy was growing, agriculture was growing. So what was to be done? Well, in the southern states, they determined that what would be important would be a self-reproducing labor force. On average, a Black woman in the United States in this period would bear 9 children, 9 more slaves. But beyond that began a domestic trade, an auction of slaves. During this period, more than 1.2 million slaves were sold at auction. Families were split up. Half of all slaves were separated from their child or their parents. A third of marriages, even though not legal, were divided when the male was sold to one person and the female to another. By 1860, Montgomery, Alabama had more slave trading locations than it had churches and hotels put together. And Charleston, South Carolina, became the slave trade capital of North America. So you saw signs like this, the Great Negro Mart. The undersigned would announce to the community at large that they will keep, can't read that, constantly on hand, a general assortment of Negroes at private sale and at auction. It was a commercial venture. This is a representation of one such sale. It's not the visual, but it is what was done for sale. Mary Jane, about 11. Martha, about 10. Louisa, about 7. Priscilla, about 9. About because slave children didn't have birth certificates. They weren't actually people. So why would you give a birth certificate to someone who's not human? All of these children of Judy. So imagine being Judy. So we turn our attention to the economic imperative in the United States through all of this. We talked about tobacco as a significant crop when the Africans began arriving. But the land was exhausted, and while westward expansion kept the tobacco crop going, what were the colonists going to do? They had this land, they needed to grow something, and so they turned to cotton. And we probably all have seen the photographs of the slaves in the cotton fields with the burlap bags around their necks as they're bent over, picking cotton, a laborious job in the broiling hot sun. But the difficult part of it was separating the spiky, sharp pieces of the boll from the fiber. And it limited the amount of cotton that could be harvested and turned into fiber and fabric until Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin in 1793. And it mechanized that separation, and the demand for cotton exploded. And the United States shifted to a textile economy. And by the mid-1800s, cotton was America's leading export. And so the reliance on slaves to pick the cotton intensified. So during this time, this continuing tension between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states continued to accelerate. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise was enacted. And it declared that it actually came about because Missouri was a territory that wanted to be admitted to the Union. But Congress wanted to maintain the equal number of slave owning and non-slave owning states. And so their solution in the Missouri Compromise was to carve out a piece of Massachusetts and make it the state of Maine. And so they admitted Missouri as a slave owning state and Maine as a free state. And the Missouri Compromise further declared that slavery in the future would be banned north of a latitude 3630. You may have heard the phrase 3630 or fight. And so that sort of put a cap on the conflict for a bit, maybe 30 years. But at that point in time, Stephen Douglas, for a variety of reasons, including building a railroad across the country, introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act that Congress passed. And it basically said, we'll accept any and all states into the US, starting with Kansas and Nebraska, and whether they allow the ownership of slaves or not, it's up to them. If the population wants it, that's great. If they don't, that's fine. But it declared the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. And actually, Kansas had two parallel legislatures for years, one asserting that Kansas was slave owning and the other asserting it was not. It was quite a process. But in any case, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, it irrevocably split the Whig Party. That time you had the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. The Democratic Party, heavily located in the South, very much in favor of slave owning, the Whig Party in the North and not. But the Northern Whigs all left the party when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. And in 1856, the Republican Party was officially formed. It was not opposed to slavery. It was opposed to the expansion of slavery. It was okay if there were slaves where there were. They just didn't want any more. And so into this period of time came a pivotal Supreme Court decision. And during this class series, we were going to hear about a number of pivotal Supreme Court decisions. This one was the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave. He was born about 1800. He had several owners, including Dr. John Emerson. And during his life, Dred Scott moved with his owner to slave states, free states, slave states, free states. And there were among those states those that said, if a slave moves to a free state, then they are declared free. But then he would go back to a slave state. Well, when Dr. Emerson died, Dred Scott and his wife became the property of Dr. Emerson's wife, Irene, and she refused to allow them their freedom. So they ended up filing suit that worked its way ultimately up to the Supreme Court, which considered the case for 3 years. And finally, on March 6th, 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, Dred Scott lost his freedom. In the majority opinion written by Chief Justice Taney, he wrote on behalf of the Supreme Court of the United States, in the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. End of the case. So by this time, Blacks have no rights, they have no agency, no autonomy. And by 1860, 80% of the United States GDP was tied in one way or another to slavery. And so comes the election of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln becomes president of the United States. There were 4 candidates for president that year. 2 Democratic candidates, John Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas, a Constitutional Union candidate, John Bell, and a Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln received a little more than 1.8 million votes. The other 3 candidates split 2.8 million votes. So by a minority of people, Abraham Lincoln, having the most of any single candidate, was named president. And within 3 months, 7 southern states seceded from the Union, followed by 4 more, and then followed by Missouri and Kentucky. And in 1861, the Civil War began. Now, there is this question as to, was the Civil War fought over slavery, or was it fought over states' rights? And the answer to that question, irrevocably, is yes. It was fought over the states' rights to sustain and retain the institution of slavery. All you have to do is read the Articles of Secession. Mississippi's is one example. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. This was apparently prior to Caribbean vacations, I guess. Anyway, these products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. And even more significantly, just days before the start of the Civil War, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, gave what became known as the Cornerstone speech. He said, "The new Constitution, that is, the Confederate Constitution, has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution." The general opinion of the men of the day, that's the people who were putting together the Constitution, was that somehow or other in the order of providence, the institution of slavery would be evanescent and pass away. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. And so the Civil War begins. In January of 1863, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation that frees 4 million slaves in the 10 southern states that are still in rebellion. It didn't address the slaves in the border states like Delaware and Maryland, but those that were fighting. And it was legitimized because they were at war, and those slaves were considered property of those with whom the United States was at war. And when those slaves were freed, it deprived the South of a lot of their workforce, and ultimately, through a range of events, Robert E. Lee ended up surrendering to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. The number here says there were 620,000 dead. More recent studies have indicated that number might have been as high as 750,000. In any case, it is a larger number than all those killed in every other war the United States has fought altogether in its history. And out of that, 179,000 African Americans fought for the Union, and 40,000 of those soldiers were killed. So the war is over, and we enter Reconstruction, which is a pivotal period, and it offered such a ray of hope for a more perfect union. It began with the passage by Congress in January of 1865, before the war even ended, of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery with an asterisk. And next week, we're going to talk about that asterisk a lot. It was ratified by a sufficient number of states by December of 1865 to be added to the Constitution, but all of the states didn't sign on. It took Delaware until 1901 to ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. It took Kentucky a while longer. They had to work the country had to work its way through the Civil Rights Movement, passage of a bunch of laws. And finally, in 1976, Kentucky said, well, all right, we'll ratify the amendment that abolishes slavery. But they weren't the last. As we will hear frequently, there's Mississippi. Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 2013. Imagine being a Black person living in Mississippi, knowing that your state government has not ratified the abolition of slavery. In any case, other steps were taken. The Freedmen's Bureau was established. It assumed custody of abandoned and confiscated lands. It oversaw relief and educational efforts for those formerly enslaved. It was an effort to bring those who had been enslaved into the life of the country. But Andrew Johnson, who took office after Abraham Lincoln was killed, was a strong Southern sympathizer. He pardoned 7,000 secessionists. He rescinded the land grants that the Freedmen's Bureau made. He opposed Black voting rights and supported white supremacy. Seeing this, Congress decided, with the rebellion continuing in the Southern states with the support of Andrew Johnson, they passed something called the Reconstruction Acts in 1867 and they passed that over Johnson's veto. And it created 5 military districts for the 10 Southern states that was designed to make sure that the amendments and the laws were being followed. In 1868, Congress passed and the states ratified the 14th Amendment that granted citizenship and due process to those who had been enslaved, in essence, overturning the Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case. But that wasn't enough to stop the white power structure from seeking to prevent Black people from voting, even though they were citizens. And so in 1870, Congress passed and the states ratified the 15th Amendment that declared that the right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of race, color, or condition of previous servitude. Which leads us to an Amnesty Act that was passed by Congress in 1872. Congress was wearying of this conflict. They wanted it to be over with. And so they granted amnesty to 150,000 former Confederate troops, and it restored Confederate leaders' right to hold public office. These were people who thought that they might be incarcerated, if not executed, as traitors to the United States. But Congress in 1872 said, no harm, no foul, back to the way the things were before the war. And so, leading up to the election of 1876, the assault on Black voters was horrific. And as it turned out, through a combination of circumstances, the day after the election, it turned out that Samuel J. Tilden, who was the governor of New York, had carried a majority of the popular vote, and he had all but one electoral vote that he needed to be named president. But three states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, had a dispute over the results of the election and who would rightfully receive the electoral votes. And so the Republicans in the House and the Supreme Court created a commission, 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, to rule on how those electoral votes would be allocated. And they made an offer to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate for president, and said, if you promise to end Reconstruction, we will give you those electoral votes and you can be president. And he did, and they did. And Reconstruction came to an end, and the federal troops were removed, and there was no longer any oversight of implementing the amendments that had come about at the end of the war. Let me stop the recording.